Hi, I'm Thomas Broadhead. I'm the editor of the Critical Performance edition of the Ives Fourth Symphony. And in this video, I'm going to talk about another addition that was made to the front matter of the score following real-world feedback I got from, in this case, the conductors at the Lucerne Festival back in 2012 when the edition was premiered. And this has to do with the passages where you have two meters going simultaneously that require a separate conducting pattern in each case, and then passages in which there are two or more tempos going at once. And the larger question is, how many assistant conductors do you need in those passages, if at all? And how should this be handled in the score? How should it be presented to convey the notation? And then how to alert the conductors that they might consider employing a second conductor, or maybe there's no need whatsoever and the main conductor can decide. So without further ado, let's look at the larger context, and then I'll get to the prompt that I got from the assistant conductors. One of the goals I had for this edition was for the notation itself to communicate the intentions of the composer throughout. And yes, there is a lengthy textual commentary on the entire piece that is the foreword to the score with the survival guide and all the different essays. And that's to help the reader of the score, the future conductor of the score, to learn how the score works, so that when the conductor then turns to the notation, it all makes sense and there are no real surprises. So here's an example of the first of the two broad categories of passages that would require an assistant conductor, ideally. And this first category are those passages where polymeters are in effect. In other words, where there are two different meters running concurrently, where there are common bar lines and common downbeats, but the players are having to think in a different meter from bar line to bar line. And in this case, half of the orchestra, approximately half, is playing in 3/2, another half is playing in 4/4. And all the instruments in 3/2 are bracketed and placed in score order at the top of the page, and all those who are playing in 4/4 are bracketed and placed at the bottom of the page. Now, in the old 1965 score, this kind of separation of the instruments by meter was not performed. Instead, the editors of that score just placed a large Roman numeral 2 before each instrument that they thought should be conducted by the assistant conductor. So they were hard-coding an interpretation of how the piece should be executed into the way that they had edited the score. I didn't want to hard-code anything here. I wanted to set things up so it was clear what was taking place, and then let the conductors decide on a case-by-case basis whether to use the assistant conductor, and then if you needed to use more than one assistant conductor. What would happen with the old 1965 edition of the score was that in these passages, the groups were never rehearsed independently and then put together. And after watching this happen several times, I realized, it's because the conductors can't really tell which instruments they're conducting. So instead of having to fight to figure out whether they're conducting the flutes and the bassoons and the cellos or whatever, they would just say, all right, everyone, let's do it. And the two conductors would conduct their two beat patterns, and the entire orchestra would play with each group having to figure out which conductor it was following, and then whatever came out of the orchestra was what came out of it. And so that's really not ideal. It's best if the two groups can be rehearsed independently and then be put together. And that is what I saw happening again and again with the new edition. In fact, every single time, the groups would be rehearsed independently and then brought together. And so, yes, it would still be a sound mass, but it would be a clearer sound mass each time than it had been with the old score. One suggestion for these passages was that everything should be notated relative to one of the meters, and just let the one meter preside over the entire passage. And that is not a great suggestion, because the problem with that is you end up with the kind of Fernie Howe-esque notation that we saw earlier in the Battle of the Triplets section. And that kind of hyper-analytical notation really just isn't helpful. Players can't read it easily at all. And so it's far better for them to read notation that actually corresponds to the meter that they are reading from. So if it's in 4/4, it should look like something that's written in 4/4, not like something that was written in 3/2 or in 7/4 or whatever. So it makes better sense to leave everything in the meters that Ives had originally written, and then just let the conductors figure out how to rehearse them so that everything can be brought together. And again, as I said, what I saw with the new edition was that these passages were rehearsed independently with two conductors and then brought together and conducted with two conductors, but with this clarity that had never been there before. The other broad category of passages where you would need an assistant conductor are those passages where there are two or more tempos going on simultaneously, where there are not common bar lines. And here, as I did with the simple polymetric passages that we were discussing earlier, I've used notation that should convey to the conductors that something special is going on that needs special attention. And here, the synchronous tempos are conveyed through the non-alignment of the bar lines between the groups. So here the bassoons and saxophone and the percussion are aligned to themselves, but their bar lines do not match up with the bar lines of the main orchestra. So here, again, there's front matter that describes this section and the difficulties it contains for the conductor, but the notation here reinforces that and clarifies a special conducting technique at the very least, and likely the use of a second conductor is required to negotiate this passage. Now, the unanswered question in all this is how many assistant conductors you need for the symphony. Do you just need one, or do you need two or more? How many do you need? Well, there are some passages where you likely need two, and here's one of them. It's in the fourth movement, and it's at measure 59, where the main orchestra is in 4/2, but certain instruments break out into 3/2, and they include the violins and the distant choir, the high winds, and then all of the violins. So you may think, well, you just need to use the assistant conductor for the 3/2 passage, right? Well, yeah, but there's a complication. The BU percussion is playing in its own tempo, right? So in a tempo that is related to the main orchestra. And if the principal conductor wants to preserve the integrity of the BU percussion and its tempo, then the assistant conductor will likely be conducting them throughout the fourth movement. Well, that means there needs to be another assistant conductor to handle the 3/2 passage. So this is an example of the kind of passage where you might actually profit from having two assistant conductors. But what if you don't? Not all orchestras will have the luxury of a second assistant conductor. And so to facilitate the execution of this passage for those affected instruments who are having to read in 3/2, I decided to provide the very kind of realization that had been suggested for the 3/2 versus 4/4 section that I was detailing earlier, where renotating one group relative to the other group's meter would make no sense because the resulting notations would just be, like hyper Ferneyhough. In this case, it turns out to be kind of Ferneyhough light, and so it's really not too much of a stretch to present it this way. So as you see, what I've done is I've presented the material twice across the passage, once in the original 3/2 meter and then a second time in 4/2. And this way, if there isn't another conductor who's conducting this passage in 3/2 against the 4/2 of the main orchestra, then the players can read from the 4/2 meter realization. And I interviewed players about this passage to see, how it was working out. And what they told me was that it was really whichever conductor was in their line of sight that would determine which staff they were reading from. And then I asked them, well, how is the notation in this 4/2 realization of it? And they said, it's really not that bad. And I'm like, which is what I suspected. I mean, it seems like it's fairly readable. So that's how I accommodated this kind of issue for this passage in particular. But it's one of the kinds of passages where you might need not just one assistant conductor, but two assistant conductors. So this brings up the larger question. Where in the score are assistant conductors likely needed? As with the old 1965 score, the initial version of this new score did not have any listing in the foreword that detailed where those locations were to be found. And during the masterclass on the score, the conductors all attended in Lucerne prior to their very first rehearsal with the full orchestra. The conductors turned to me and said, "Wait a minute, where are the places where we need to figure out how many conductors are conducting and how it's to be divided up and so on?" I thought, oh, that's right. It's all there, and I've tried to make it notationally clear, but I haven't provided a listing of those places, and nor is there any commentary. So here is a dedicated list that I've created that was added to the score after the Lucerne Festival in 2012, where I go movement by movement and point out every location where it would seem likely that it would be profitable to have an assistant conductor beating alongside the main conductor. And then it concludes with a section with the larger question, how many assistant conductors are truly required? And I do go into that 3-2 versus 4-2 passage in the fourth movement that we were covering at the end, because that's crucial to figuring out if you need to have, 2 or 3 conductors all together. So again, this was the kind of thing that I had considered, and it was in my head, and I knew where the places were, and I set up the score to clarify those places, but I forgot that it would really be helpful if there was just a listing of them all, so the conductor could then go through the list and go to those passages in the score and then determine as a team, how each passage was to be executed. Again, an example of the benefit of the real-world feedback that I was getting from attending rehearsals of this edition before it finally met publication.